Is the UFC in decline?
I'll tell you the story, how it began.
UFC has officially been sold
for $4 billion.
The only thing people remembered about the UFC was the no rules days.
Whether bad or good, you knew what the UFC was. This business is so massive because it doesn't matter what color you are, what country you come from, or what language you speak. We're all human beings and fighting's in our DNA, man. We get it and we like it. Hopefully I've built a business that will last many, many years after I'm dead. You watch interviews of me from day one, I'm like, this thing's gonna be the biggest sport in the world.
Why do we keep hearing about the underpaying stuff?
UFC fighters are just underpaid considering how much money did Zuffa make.
And you say that the UFC punishes fighters?
Let me tell you the rest of the story.
After having tremendous pay-per-view sales, a bunch of superstars, as well as being one of the fastest growing sports and being one of the fastest growing companies in America and in general in the world, during the COVID era, it seems as of late, over the last year or so, a lot of those things that I just mentioned are going in the wrong direction. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm JuicyMMA. I make opinionative MMA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. But anyways, let's get into it. At this point, basically everybody knows a story about the UFC. Originally, the UFC was in a very bad position. But after Dana White and the Fertitta brothers were able to take over the company, they were able to turn it around in a very positive way. As although early on it didn't necessarily change overnight, over the long haul, they were able to do a tremendous job at boosting pay-per-view numbers, at acquiring more talent into the company, as well as just building the sport in general. And although they did a tremendous job at making the company a pretty well-known one, everything completely changed during the pandemic. During the pandemic in March of 2020, every single sports organization shut down. Whether you talk about the NBA, the NFL, the MLB, or the NHL, all these organizations were shutting down with no reopening plans in sight. But there was one organization that wasn't like the rest, and that was the UFC. Although the UFC also shut down for a short period of time, they were one of the first to reopen, and they were the first of one of the major sports to reopen its doors and start putting on events again. And that turned out to be one of, if not the best decisions the company had ever made. Not only did the UFC make a lot of money and sell a lot of pay-per-views in the short term, but they were also able to introduce a lot of new potential fans and soon-to-be fans to MMA and the UFC in general. And that success that the UFC had during the pandemic extended after that, as pay-per-view numbers were still growing, as the UFC was still introducing new talent to their organization, and new fans were being introduced to MMA each and every day. But although the UFC has been extremely successful and still continues to be extremely successful, in 2024 and part of 2025, there started to arise a bunch of different issues with the company that have fans scratching their head. So a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, what are those issues? Well, in my opinion, I think there's a bunch of issues with the UFC at this current moment. But the first thing I want to touch upon is a lack of stars. Because when you look during the pandemic and even before the pandemic, the UFC had a tremendous amount of stars. Whether you talked about Conor McGregor, Brock Lesnar, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Ronda Rousey, Nate Diaz, Jorge Masvidal, and others, there was a ton you can list. There was a ton of fighters in the UFC that you can put on a pay-per-view event to sell that pay-per-view at extraordinary numbers. But when you look around the UFC at this point, although there are guys that I would consider stars, they are nowhere near the level of some of the other fighters that I mentioned prior. When you look around the UFC today, you talk about guys like Alex Pereira, Islam Makhachev, Ilia Topuria, maybe Dricus du Plessis, Khamzat Chimaev, and some other guys as well. And although those guys do all sell pay-per-views pretty well and pretty effectively, at the end of the day, I don't think they're anywhere near some of those other fighters that I mentioned prior. So at this point, I do really think the lack of stars is a huge issue for the company and is a huge issue for their pay-per-view sales that have been in decline as of late. So something that some of you may be wondering at this point is, how does the UFC solve this? In my opinion, I think it's a pretty simple fix, and that is to create rivalries. When you talk about some of those guys that I was talking about before, when you talk about Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz, John Jones, DC even, a lot of those guys had rivalries. Of course, they were all popular prior to those matchups, but when you talk about the Conor-Nate matchups, the first and the second, those really builded both of the fighters' star power significantly. And when you talk about John Jones versus DC, the same thing could be said about them, as after both of their fights they had together, both of their star powers for Jon Jones and DC grew significantly. So at this point you may be wondering, what potential rivalries could the UFC put together? Well, in my opinion, I think there's a couple of different answers, but the first and most obvious answer is Islam Makhachev versus Ilia Topuria. When you're talking about two guys that are top 3 pound for pound fighters, two guys that are in the midst of their primes, two guys that are or were former champions in Islam Makhachev, who is a current champion, or Ilia Topuria, who is a former champion only because he vacated the belt, not because he lost it, I think it's a very obvious matchup. And regardless of who wins the first fight, I think both guys are good enough to the point where they'll eventually fight again, and maybe the other guy wins the next fight and possibly creates a rivalry there. Now obviously it's not a guarantee. Maybe Islam Makhachev knocks out or finishes Ilia Topuria relatively early and the rivalry completely dies there, or maybe vice versa, Ilia Topuria knocks out or finishes Islam Makhachev relatively early and the rivalry ends there. But at the end of the day, I think there's a real chance to make Ilia Topuria as well as Islam Makhachev a huge star, a significantly bigger star than they are currently, based on that rivalry and based on that fight. And I think it's something that the UFC has to put together. Now, another potential rivalry the UFC could put together is Khamzat Chimaev versus Dricus du Plessis, as both guys appear to be at the top of their games right now, and they both appear to have a bunch of years left in MMA and in the UFC, so that could potentially be another answer. But at the end of the day, the Islam versus Ilia is the main thing that I'm looking for and the main rivalry that I think the UFC can put together. Now, the next reason for why fans think the UFC is dying, at least to a certain extent, is due to the lack of pay-per-view sales. And I think this could be attributed to a bunch of different things. The first thing is something that I just touched upon, which is due to the lack of stars. The next thing that I think it could be attributed to is due to the pay-per-view price. As at $75 per pay-per-view, I think the UFC is really pricing out a lot of fans that would have otherwise paid for the pay-per-views. If the pay-per-views were, let's say, $50 or let's say even $25, I think their pay-per-view sales would be significantly higher than they are currently. But the last reason for why I think the pay-per-view numbers are going down is due to the quality of cards. When you look at some of the pay-per-views in 2024 and early in 2025, yeah, there are certain cards that the UFC looks to stack. When you talk about a card in New York, when you talk about a card in Saudi Arabia, when you talk about a card in Vegas for International Fight Week and Miami and some other cards, yes, they do look to stack those cards, and those cards do perform pretty well. But outside of those cards that I just mentioned, some of the other events and some of the other pay-per-views that the UFC puts together turn out to be pretty poor. As maybe the main event may be a pretty good or pretty decent title fight, but outside of that, the co-main event, the rest of the main card, the prelims don't turn out to be all that great. There's a lot of unranked fighters on the cards, there's a lot of unranked fighters even in the main cards of some pay-per-views as of late, and because of that, the interest from fans just isn't there, especially considering all pay-per-views are $75 a pop. So what's the solution to this? I think it's pretty simple. Move to Netflix. I think if the UFC moves to Netflix, it would solve all those issues that I just mentioned. Moving to Netflix would lower the price or possibly even eliminate the price of pay-per-views. Netflix has been notoriously known at not liking the pay-per-view model. When you look at some of the live events that they put on their platform, most of them have not been pay-per-views. And if the UFC were to move to Netflix, it's possible that the same could be true for them as well. But even if that's being overly optimistic, I think at the bare minimum, the price of pay-per-views would be lower on a Netflix platform. Maybe that will be at $50 a pay-per-view, maybe that will be $25 a pay-per-view, but at the bare minimum, I do think it's going to be less than the current $75 asking price that the UFC is currently having for pay-per-views. Now, the next benefit for the UFC moving to Netflix is I think there's going to be a lot more pressure on the UFC to perform. Currently with ESPN, both ESPN and the UFC are both happy with their deals. As the UFC is putting on an event every single week, ESPN is making a decent amount of money off them. The UFC is also making a decent amount of money off ESPN, and there's really not that emphasis to put on bigger and better events with ESPN. But I think if the UFC moved over to Netflix, they would need to perform a little bit and maybe even a lot better than they currently are at this point. I think Netflix would push the UFC to put on more exciting and more talent-stacked pay-per-view cards. I think they'll also focus a little bit more on fight nights, maybe getting out of the Apex, maybe putting on more exciting and more events outside of the Apex, which would also be a huge benefit to fans. And I think overall, the pressure of moving to a with Netflix in performing better for the UFC will be a net positive for everybody involved. So overall, do I think the UFC is dying? I don't think so. I still think there's a lot of talent on the roster at this point, a tremendous amount of talent. I do think the UFC is still putting together really good pay-per-views, really stacked pay-per-views. I think there's still even really good fight nights that they put together every so often. But at the end of the day, even though I think there's a lot good with the company, I do at the same time think there is a lot of room for improvement for the company as well. And I think a move to Netflix, a move to rivalries, a move to putting together and building more stars in the company would be a net benefit for them and will make the company even bigger and more rich going forward long term. But I guess only time will tell what does end up happening for the UFC as well as MMA as a whole. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you agree that the UFC is dying, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.